My name is Emily Carter. I am 30 years old, and last year my brother's wedding changed everything I thought I knew about family. That night, under the chandeliers and champagne toasts, I watched my parents hand him the deed to the house we had both grown up in while I stood there with nothing. It was the moment I realized I had been pushed out, replaced, erased. But what none of them knew was that in my pocket I carried a secret powerful enough to rewrite the story. And the question I kept asking myself was simple. What would happen if they ever found out? The chandeliers sparkled above me, casting a warm golden light across the ballroom. The air smelled of roses and champagne, the kind of luxury that makes you feel like you stepped into someone else's life. My brother Michael looked like he belonged here, 32, handsome in his tuxedo, smiling, as if the entire world existed only to celebrate him. Lauren, his bride, was radiant in her lace gown, diamonds flashing at her ears and wrist as if she had stepped out of a bridal magazine. I stood a few feet away, holding my bouquet of soft blush roses, the satin ribbon pressing against my palm. I had picked the flowers myself, making sure they matched the bridesmaids' dresses, and wrapped their wedding gift carefully with a silver bow. I told myself I was happy for them, that this day was about love and family, that it wasn't about me. The reception was loud and filled with laughter. Crystal glasses, clinked plates of salmon and filet mignon were carried out, and people toasted to love, prosperity, and the future. Then suddenly my father's deep voice cut through the noise. "Dad." David Carter stood tall in his navy suit, hair silvered at the temples, his posture straight like the lawyer he had been for decades. Mom Margaret was beside him, her pearl necklace glowing under the lights. They looked proud, expectant. And then I noticed the man in the gray suit with them. It was Mr. Collins, our family attorney. I had seen him before, but never had reason to speak to him. My father smiled, raising his glass slightly. He said today was not only the beginning of Michael and Lauren's marriage, but also a new chapter for the Carter family. Mr. Collins unfolded papers and began to read in that formal tone that always sounded so cold to me. He spoke of the house in San Francisco, the house I grew up in, the white Victorian on the corner with the blue shutters, the one with the oak tree out front where Michael and I used to climb, the house with the scuff marks on the hallway wall where we measured our heights every year, the house that held every memory of birthdays, holidays, laughter, and even tears. And then he said it. As of today, the property valued at $3 million was being transferred into Michael and Lauren's names as part of their new life together. Applause erupted. Glasses were lifted. Michael leaned down to kiss Lauren, both of them beaming. My parents clapped proudly. Guests cheered, the sound echoing off the ballroom walls. And I stood there frozen, my smile stuck on my face like paint that wouldn't dry, my hands trembling around the bouquet. My heart pounded in my ears. That was my home too. My bedroom with the pale yellow curtains, the floor where I had spilled nail polish in 10th grade, the desk where I stayed up cramming for college exams. All of it now belonged to them. As if I had never been there. As if my years and my memories meant nothing. I forced myself to clap, but my palms barely met. My throat burned as I swallowed hard, fighting back tears. This was Michael's wedding. I would not make a scene. I would not embarrass him or my parents. I would smile and act like this was fine. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught Lauren glancing at me. She leaned slightly toward one of her bridesmaids, her lips curling into a smirk. Her voice was loud enough for those around her to hear. "Emily does not really need a house anyway. When she gets married, her husband will take care of her." Laughter rippled around the table. Some chuckled awkwardly, others looked away as if they knew it was cruel, but did not want to be involved. The sound stabbed through me, each giggle another reminder that I was the punchline, the afterthought, the disposable daughter. I pressed my lips together until they hurt my vision, blurring with tears I refused to let fall. My parents did not correct her. My father kept his arm around my mother, smiling proudly at the happy couple. Michael didn't say a word, just pulled Lauren closer as if her words were harmless banter. I excused myself as calmly as I could, telling the people near me that I needed some fresh air. I walked quickly through the ballroom heels, clicking against the marble floor until I reached the balcony outside. The night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of salt from the bay. The city lights sparkled below, glittering like a million tiny secrets. I gripped the railing with both hands until my knuckles turned white. Behind me, the music swelled again, the clink of glasses and bursts of laughter filling the air. But out here alone, the ache in my chest grew heavier. I thought of the home that was no longer mine. I thought of Lauren's smirk and the laughter of people I barely knew. I thought of my brother, my own flesh and blood, standing silent while my place in the family was stripped away in front of everyone. I had told myself this was Michael's day, that I would not be selfish. But the truth was, I had just been erased. With a few words from Mr. Collins and a smirk from my new sister-in-law, I was no longer part of the future of this family. I leaned against the railing, staring out at the city that suddenly felt both endless and suffocating. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to be truly alone. When I came back home after the wedding, the house didn't feel like mine anymore. The living room still carried a faint trace of roses from the reception centerpieces, and there were empty champagne flutes scattered on the counter. But the warmth that used to welcome me was gone. I climbed the stairs, slowly clutching my small clutch bag, hoping that at least my bedroom, the one place that had always been mine, would still feel familiar. The moment I pushed open the door, my breath caught. Boxes. Stacks and stacks of wedding gifts were piled high, lining the walls and spilling across the floor. Silverware sets, unopened kitchen appliances, a tower of designer luggage, and expensive crystal glasses still in packaging. My bed, the bed I had slept in since I was 15, was hidden under ribbons and tissue paper. My desk was buried beneath gift baskets and shopping bags. The posters I had tacked to the walls years ago looked childish, now dwarfed by luxury items that didn't belong to me. It no longer looked like my room. It looked like a storage unit for Michael and Lauren's new life. I stood frozen at the doorway, clutching the frame to steady myself. My sanctuary had been stripped away without a word. The one place that had carried my secrets, my tears, and my small victories was now reduced to a backdrop for someone else's future. From downstairs came the sound of laughter, muffled but sharp. Lauren's voice carried easily through the house, full of confidence and authority, as if she had always belonged here. I forced my legs to move one step at a time down the staircase. Each creak of the wood beneath me felt heavier than the last. They were gathered in the dining room. Michael and Lauren sat side by side, close enough that their shoulders touched her hand, resting lightly on his arm. Mom was fussing with the teapot, pouring them fresh cups as if they were the honored guests in their own home. Dad sat reclined in his usual chair, the newspaper spread open, glancing only occasionally at the conversation. Lauren's words floated across the table. She was talking about starting a family, about wanting to plan for a baby right away. She flipped her shiny brown hair over her shoulder and smiled at Michael like she already knew he'd agree. She said she wanted a nanny, but not just any nanny. She wanted a live-in nanny, someone who could care for the baby day and night, handle the laundry, and keep the house running smoothly. She said she'd already asked friends and knew exactly how much it would cost. Michael hesitated, his voice tentative. He said the house wasn't that big, that with only 3 bedrooms space would be tight. He suggested maybe a day nanny instead, someone who came in during the day and left at night. Lauren's tone sharpened instantly. She said she didn't want a babysitter who clocked out at 6, and she wanted someone who would live in, who could be trusted completely. Especially, she added, since she planned on going back to work after maternity leave. She said it with conviction, like the decision was already made, and Michael's doubts were nothing more than an inconvenience. I stood quietly at the doorway, unsure if I should interrupt. But then Lauren's gaze shifted, her eyes sliding to me. She looked at me for a long moment, and in her silence I felt the weight of what was coming. When she finally spoke, her smile was polite, but her words were knives. "Well, if we're bringing in a nanny, maybe Emily should think about finding her own place. That way the nanny would have a proper room, and things wouldn't feel so crowded." The room went silent. My heart dropped, though I forced my face to stay calm. Mom shifted in her chair, her voice soft but cutting in its own way. "Emily, you know how it is. You're young independent. Girls can always manage to figure things out. Maybe it would be good for you to try living on your own." She said it kindly with a gentle smile, as though she were offering advice. But every word landed like a slap. I turned toward her, searching her face for a sign, any sign that she still saw me as her daughter, as someone who belonged here. But her eyes slid away back to the teacup she cradled in her hands. Dad didn't even lower his newspaper. He made a sound something between a cough and a grunt, but didn't speak. Lauren leaned her head against Michael's shoulder, satisfied, like she had scored the final point in a game I hadn't even agreed to play. Michael's silence was deafening. He didn't argue. He didn't defend me. He didn't even look at me. His silence told me everything I needed to know. My face burned hot humiliation flooding my chest, but I refused to let them see me break. I curved my lips into a smile that felt like it might split my skin. I murmured an excuse about being tired and walked back upstairs, shutting the door firmly behind me. I leaned against it, the muffled sound of their voices drifting up through the floorboards. Their laughter, their plans, their future, all of it reverberated through the walls. Each sound pressed into me like a reminder that I had no say here, no place in the life they were building together. I sat down on the edge of my bed, or what used to be my bed, surrounded by their unopened gifts, their shiny new possessions, their promises of a life that had nothing to do with me. My chest ached. My hands trembled, but this time it wasn't the fear of being erased that cut deepest. It was the realization that I had been reduced to an obstacle. Something to be shifted aside, politely explained away as young and independent, while they carved out their picture of family. I stared at the floor until my vision blurred, and in that blur a different truth settled. It wasn't just that I had lost a place in the house. I had lost the illusion that my family would ever put me first. And that loss was heavier than any box stacked against the wall. The next morning the house was quiet, except for the sound of coffee brewing in the kitchen. I had barely slept. My mind replayed Lauren's smirk, my mother's gentle dismissal, and my brother's silence until the sun crept through the blinds. When I finally dragged myself downstairs, I saw my father sitting at the dining room table with a folder in front of him. Mom sat beside him, her hands folded neatly on the tablecloth. Michael and Lauren were already there, their faces calm, almost expectant. A man in a tailored gray suit was standing at the end of the table. It was the same attorney from the wedding, Mr. Collins. His leather briefcase rested on the chair beside him, and he was flipping through a thick stack of papers. My father looked up as if this were just another routine family meeting. He gestured for me to sit down. I lowered myself into a chair opposite Lauren, who offered me a thin smile before turning her gaze back to the attorney. Mr. Collins cleared his throat. He spoke in a flat, rehearsed voice as he explained the trust documents. He said the San Francisco house, the one my parents had bought 30 years ago when they were newly married, had officially been placed in Michael and Lauren's names. He emphasized that the transfer was complete and legally binding. My father signed the papers first, his pen gliding across the page without hesitation. Mom followed her hand steady even as she passed the folder across the table. Michael leaned forward and signed with a flourish, as if it were the easiest thing in the world. Lauren took her turn, her engagement ring catching the morning light, the sparkle taunting me as she pressed the pen to paper. I watched each of them, my stomach tightening with every signature. The sound of the pen scratching on paper felt louder than anything else in the room. It was the sound of doors closing, of ties being cut. When Mr. Collins finally looked up, his gaze landed on me. His voice was polite but cold. He explained that under the terms of the trust, only Michael and Lauren had rights to the property moving forward. He said plainly that I no longer had any legal claim or entitlement to the house. His words echoed in my head, stripping away the last fragile thread I'd been clinging to. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. All I could think of were the memories that lived in those walls, the nights I stayed up studying in my room, the way Mom used to call us down for dinner, the Christmas mornings when Michael and I tore open presents by the fireplace. None of that mattered anymore. Legally, it was no longer mine. Lauren reached across the table to squeeze Michael's hand. She looked radiant, her expression soft as she said how grateful she was for my parents' generosity, how she and Michael would take good care of the house and honor its legacy. My parents nodded, pleased. I felt invisible. It was as if I had never lived there, as if my years of growing up in that house had been erased with a stroke of a pen. I looked to my mother, hoping she might acknowledge me, reassure me that this did not mean what it so clearly meant. But she kept her eyes on the documents. My father leaned back in his chair, satisfied. I swallowed hard, my throat raw. The attorney slid the final copies back into his folder, snapped it shut, and shook hands with my parents. He wished Michael and Lauren well before leaving. The sound of the front door clicking shut seemed to mark the end of something I could never get back. Silence filled the room for a moment. I wanted to scream, to demand why, to ask how they could do this without even talking to me. But I sat frozen, my hands gripping the edge of my chair. My father finally broke the silence. He said this was for the best, that Michael was the eldest son, that it made sense for him to take over the family home. He said I was young, capable, and that when the time came I would make my own life somewhere else. His tone was final, as if he had rehearsed these lines in his head and convinced himself they were fair. I could feel my pulse hammering in my temples. Michael looked at me, but he said nothing. Not a word of defense, not a gesture of regret. He just sat there, fingers entwined with Lauren's content to let me fade out of the picture. It hit me then, sharp and undeniable. I had been cut out, erased, not just emotionally, but legally, officially. I was no longer part of the home I grew up in. My family had chosen, and it was not me. I excused myself, my voice barely audible, and walked out of the dining room. My feet carried me upstairs, though I had no destination. When I closed my bedroom door behind me, I pressed my back against it and let the silence sink in. The truth wasn't in the way they spoke or even in their silence. It was in ink and signatures in legal language that turned childhood into a transaction. Sitting on the floor with my knees pulled tight to my chest, I understood my name had been written out of the future, not with cruelty, but with paperwork that could never be undone. I packed what little I could fit into 2 suitcases and left San Francisco behind. The flight east felt endless, the hours dragging as I stared out the window at the clouds, replaying every word spoken at the dining table. I tried to close my eyes, but sleep never came. Every time I drifted close, I heard Lauren's laugh, my mother's dismissal, and the cold finality of the lawyer's voice. When the plane finally landed at Newark Airport, I carried my bags onto the train, my body heavy but restless, my heart pounding with the uncertainty of what waited ahead. The city outside the train windows looked gray, almost harsh, but it was also a place where no one knew my name. That anonymity felt like both a gift and a curse. By evening, I was standing in front of a tired old brick building in the heart of Newark. The paint peeled from the window frames, the hallway smelled faintly of bleach and something fried. I unlocked the door to my studio apartment and stepped inside. The place was barely 400 square feet, small enough that I could see everything at once. The rent was $1,600 a month, not including utilities, and it showed in the details. The walls were a dull beige, the carpet worn thin in spots, and the single window looked out over a narrow alley where the smell of grease from the diner downstairs drifted in at all hours. I set my suitcases down and looked around. The tiny kitchen had 2 burners and a refrigerator that hummed loudly, almost like it was breathing. The bathroom tiles were chipped, the mirror spotted with age, and the shower curtain clung damply to the tub. Still, it was mine. For the first time, I closed the door and knew no one could tell me to leave. No one could stack boxes on my bed or sign away my home. It was a strange mix of freedom and fear, as if I had been cut loose into the world with nothing but my own 2 hands. My salary after taxes was $3,500 a month. Once the rent, utilities, and groceries were paid, almost nothing remained. I became careful with every expense. Nights were simple meals, often plain, but it was enough to keep going. And there were moments of grace. My neighbor across the hall, Mrs. Johnson, was 70 years old, a widow with curly gray hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. The first time I met her, she knocked on my door, holding a plate of warm cornbread. She said she had seen me moving in and wanted to make sure I had something to eat after a long day. The smell of butter and honey filled my tiny apartment, and I nearly cried. I thanked her with a voice that shook, and she just patted my arm gently. She told me if I ever needed anything, I could knock on her door. The next time we crossed paths in the hallway, she remembered my name. Over the next few weeks, she became the only person who asked how I was really doing. Sometimes she waved from her doorway. Sometimes she left a bag of apples or cookies outside mine. It struck me deeply how this woman who had known me for days showed more care than my own parents had in months. Still, the weight of reality pressed hard. Every time I sat down to pay bills, my chest tightened. There was no cushion, no backup plan. If I lost my job or got sick, everything would collapse. At night, I lay awake, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, wondering how I had gone from a daughter of a comfortable family to a woman balancing on the edge of survival. The silence of the apartment often grew too loud, filled with the echoes of what I had lost. One evening I came home from work exhausted, my body aching from the day. I climbed the narrow stairs, dropped my bag inside the door, and was about to sit down when there was a firm knock. I froze for a moment, my pulse quickening, then opened the door to find Mr. Miller, the landlord. He was in his 50s, balding with a sharp look in his eyes that seemed to measure every word before it was spoken. He asked if I had the rent ready for next month. His tone was not unkind, but it carried an edge, a reminder of the rules I was now bound by. I nodded quickly, saying yes, of course I would have it. He reminded me he needed it on the first no exceptions. Then he gave me a short nod and walked away without waiting for more conversation. I closed the door and leaned against it, my stomach sinking. It wasn't that I didn't have the money, but the reminder stung. There was no grace period, no understanding, no safety net. I was no longer living under my parents' roof, no longer someone who could rely on anyone else. Every month would be a battle, every bill a reminder of how fragile my situation was. I sat on the edge of my narrow bed, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. The air in the room felt too heavy, pressing against my chest. I thought about how easily one misstep could undo everything I was holding together. A missed paycheck, an unexpected illness, a late rent payment. The line between stability and collapse was razor thin, and I was walking it every day. And yet in that small, dim apartment, I felt something else too. Pride. Pride that I had made it this far on my own, that I had survived the humiliation, the betrayal, the coldness of people who were supposed to love me. Fear lived in the corners of that apartment, but so did resilience. For the first time in my life, I truly understood what it meant to stand alone. And though it terrified me, it also whispered of strength I had never known I carried. The office was buzzing that morning, the smell of burnt coffee hanging in the air, as everyone crowded into the break room. Phones rang in the background. Printers spat out paper, and the low hum of chatter filled the space. I kept my head down, balancing my laptop and a stack of papers as I made my way to my desk. Working as a marketing associate in a small agency in Newark was supposed to be my fresh start, a chance to build something on my own. But the whispers followed me everywhere, like shadows I could never shake. I heard them before I saw their faces. Two women from accounting stood by the coffee machine, leaning close but not close enough to lower their voices. One of them said she had seen photos on Instagram. My brother had just bought his wife a brand new black SUV, gleaming in the driveway of their San Francisco home. The other laughed softly and said she couldn't believe his sister Me was living in a rundown studio in Newark, barely scraping by. Their laughter was light casual, but it sliced through me all the same. To them it was gossip. To me it was my life laid bare in the cruelest way. I clenched my jaw and kept walking, pretending I hadn't heard. But the words clung to me as I sat at my desk, the room suddenly feeling smaller, the walls pressing in. I opened my laptop and forced myself into the numbers for a campaign report, but the voices carried faint and sharp, each syllable a reminder that I was an object of curiosity, of ridicule. By lunchtime, the unease had settled deep into my chest. I had planned to eat quietly at my desk, but one of the interns waved me over with a cheerful smile. I didn't want to seem rude, so I carried my salad container to the long table in the break room. I sat down carefully, wishing I could fold myself smaller and visible. It didn't take long before the questions came. A guy from sales, loud and confident, leaned forward with his fork still in his hand. He said he'd heard my family was well off, that my brother had a huge house in San Francisco. Then, with a smirk that made my stomach twist, he asked why I didn't inherit anything. Why I was renting a cramped studio in Newark instead of living the kind of life people assumed I had access to. The table went silent. Forks hovered in the air. All eyes turned to me. My cheeks burned hot, my hands tightening around the flimsy plastic fork until it bent in half. I opened my mouth, but the words caught in my throat. What could I possibly say that my parents had signed away everything without a second thought? That my brother and his wife had been handed the future while I was pushed into the shadows, that I had been erased from my own family, the silence stretched on too long, too heavy. I felt the weight of their judgment, their curiosity curdling into pity, maybe even disdain. My chest ached with the humiliation of it, and I wanted the ground to open up and swallow me whole. Then from across the table, Ethan Walker spoke. He was 29. A senior account manager, his sleeves rolled up, a pen still tucked behind his ear from jotting down notes earlier. He glanced around, then chuckled lightly, breaking the tension. "Why are we even talking about this?" he said, shaking his head. "We've got a pitch tomorrow, and if we don't nail it, none of us will be able to afford rent." A few people laughed awkwardly, the weight shifting. Ethan reached into his bag and pulled out a rough sketch of a campaign concept he'd been drafting. He spread it across the table, pointing out his ideas. The group leaned in curiosity, drawn to something safer, something that mattered. The awkward moment dissolved as quickly as it had formed. The conversation pulled away from me like a current changing direction. I sat frozen for a moment, my chest still tight, watching Ethan steer the attention elsewhere. Relief flooded me, but it was laced with shame. I hated that I needed saving, and hated that my silence had spoken louder than words. When lunch ended, I slipped back to my desk, my hands trembling as I typed. My eyes blurred over the spreadsheet, the numbers swimming on the screen. I felt humiliated, stripped bare in front of my colleagues. No matter how hard I worked, no matter how many late nights I stayed behind polishing presentations, I would always be the girl whose brother had it all while she scraped by in a shabby apartment. I pressed my palms to my face, trying to steady my breathing. Shame burned hot through me, tangled with something sharper: anger. Anger at my parents, at Michael, at Lauren, but mostly at myself. At myself for sitting there quietly while strangers dissected my life like it was entertainment. For letting them see me as small, powerless. The rest of the afternoon dragged on endlessly. Every laugh that broke across the office made me flinch. Were they laughing about me again? Every whisper felt like a knife pressed against my back. I couldn't escape the feeling of being exposed, my private failures transformed into public spectacle. By the time I shut down my computer and walked out into the fading light, I felt smaller than I had in years. The streets outside buzzed with the evening rush, strangers brushing past me without a glance. I pulled my coat tighter and hurried toward the subway, the weight of the day pressing me down with every step. On the train, I caught my reflection in the window. Tired eyes, clenched jaw, the hollow look of someone who had been pushed too far into the shadows. My chest ached with the realization. I hated how easily I had become a subject of gossip, how little it took to make me feel invisible and exposed. For the first time, I truly saw myself through their eyes. Not Emily Carter, the hard-working associate who stayed late to meet deadlines, but the forgotten sister of Michael Carter, the one left behind. And that thought cut deeper than I wanted to admit. The morning after that humiliating day at the office, I walked in with my head lowered, hoping no one would notice me. As I passed the conference room, Olivia Reed called out my name. She was a senior consultant 10 years older than me, always dressed sharply in tailored blazers and heels that clicked with confidence down the hallways. I paused, unsure if I had done something wrong, but she smiled and asked if I wanted to grab coffee during lunch. I almost said no. I was still nursing the sting of gossip, And the last thing I wanted was another conversation about my family, but something in her voice made me agree. At noon, we walked down the block to a quiet cafe with worn leather chairs and the smell of roasted beans heavy in the air. Olivia ordered a cappuccino, and I stuck to a plain black coffee, counting the dollars in my head. We sat by the window, the light catching in her auburn hair as she studied me for a moment. She said she had noticed how uncomfortable I looked yesterday and that she wanted to tell me something important. Then she leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. You cannot live your whole life waiting for your family to throw you scraps of kindness. The words landed like a weight in my chest. I shifted in my seat, trying to protest, but she raised her hand gently. She told me she knew what it was like to be overlooked. Her parents had favored her brother for years, giving him the family business while she had to fight for every step in her career. She said it took her too long to realize she didn't need their approval to succeed. I listened, my hands wrapped tightly around the warm cup. Her words sliced through the fog I had been living in. Then she asked me about my finances. I laughed nervously, admitting there wasn't much to talk about. I told her about my rent, my bills, how my paycheck barely stretched from one month to the next. She didn't laugh. Instead, she nodded and pulled a small notebook from her bag. On one page, she wrote 3 words: save, invest, grow. She explained the basics, things I had never paid attention to. How even a small emergency fund could change the way I slept at night. How putting money into an index fund or a retirement account could build over time, little by little, until I had something solid. She spoke with ease, but her eyes were serious. You are smart enough to build a future, Emily. But you have to stop waiting for someone else to hand it to you. Her conviction stirred something inside me. I thought about my studio apartment, the thin walls, the way I flinched when the landlord knocked. I thought about sitting at the office table while my coworkers dissected my life as if it were a soap opera. For the first time, I felt a flicker of possibility. Maybe I could write a different story for myself. I admitted that I had always assumed my family would be my safety net. When the time came, they would be there to help me buy a home, start a family, and stand on solid ground. But now that net had been cut, and I was free-falling, Olivia's gaze softened. Then let the fall push you, she said. Sometimes the ground you hit becomes the foundation for something new. I sat there, stunned into silence. The cafe buzzed with quiet conversations, the barista steaming milk, the hum of life carrying on outside. But for me, the moment felt still. Something shifted in the air. I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words settle into my bones. I realized that I had been clinging to a hope that would never come. That waiting for my family to see me, to value me, was like standing in the rain hoping for the sun. We finished our coffee, and she scribbled a few resources on a napkin. Books to read, websites to follow, apps that could help me track my spending. She slid it across the table with a smile. Start small, she said, but start. Walking back to the office, the cold wind whipped at my coat, but I felt strangely lighter. For the first time in months, the shame and anger didn't feel quite as suffocating. There was a different kind of fire building in me, one that whispered I didn't have to stay in the shadows of my family's choices. I could build a life that was mine, one decision at a time. That night, sitting in my tiny studio, I opened a new spreadsheet on my laptop. I wrote down every dollar I earned, every expense, and for the first time, I added a column labeled savings. It wasn't much, but it was mine. As I shut the computer, I caught my reflection in the window. My face still carried the weight of disappointment, but behind it was something else, something unfamiliar: determination. And in that quiet moment, I understood that my life didn't have to be defined by what my family had taken from me. It could be defined by what I chose to build next. It had been another long day at the office, the kind where the hours blurred together under the glow of fluorescent lights. By the time I stepped into the chilly night air, my body ached with exhaustion. On the way back to my apartment, I ducked into the corner grocery store for some milk and bread. At the counter, the clerk asked if I wanted to add a Powerball ticket. I hesitated, my wallet already thin, but something made me nod. I handed over a couple of crumpled bills, slipped the ticket into my coat pocket, and walked out without thinking twice. The following week came and went. Work piled up, bills arrived, and the ticket stayed buried in my pocket, forgotten among receipts and lint. Life didn't pause for little slips of paper. One Friday afternoon, Olivia stopped by my desk, her smile wide and her eyes sparkling. She told me she had won $500 on a Powerball ticket she bought at the gas station. She laughed, waving the winning stub in the air, saying it wasn't much, but it felt like the universe had given her a wink. Her words jolted something in my memory. That night back in my cramped studio, I dug through my coat until my fingers brushed against the wrinkled paper. I smoothed it out on the kitchen counter, staring at the faded numbers I had barely paid attention to when I bought it. The lottery drawing had already aired hours earlier. My heart thudded as I pulled up the winning numbers on my phone. The screen glowed in the dim light of my apartment, and I read them out loud one by one, my voice trembling. First number matched. Second number matched. My breathing quickened. Third, fourth, fifth, all matched. My chest tightened, and my hands shook so violently I had to sit down. Then my eyes moved to the Powerball number, and it was there too. All 6 numbers. I froze. The world tilted, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly deafening. I read the numbers again and again, convinced I had made a mistake, that my tired eyes were tricking me. But every time they lined up perfectly. $300 million. The figure sat heavy in my mind, too large to comprehend. My stomach twisted, and I pressed a hand to my mouth to keep from screaming. My knees gave way, and I sank to the floor, clutching the ticket as if it might vanish if I loosened my grip. For a long time I just sat there, the apartment spinning around me. Images flashed through my head. Michael and Lauren laughing in their new house. My parents signing papers without glancing in my direction. The stares of my coworkers, their whispers about my shabby life. And now in my hands, a secret that could shatter all of it. Tears pricked my eyes, but they weren't the same tears of humiliation I had cried before. These were hot, wild tears of disbelief and terror. Because as much as I wanted to rejoice, I was terrified. I couldn't tell anyone. Not Olivia, not Ethan, certainly not my family. If they knew, they would circle like vultures. They would smile and say all the right things, but I had seen enough of their true faces to know better. I folded the ticket, carefully slid it into an envelope, and tucked it into the drawer under my sweaters. Then I locked the drawer, though I knew a flimsy lock wouldn't keep away the fear that someone might find out. I paced the length of my tiny apartment, whispering to myself that it was real, that I was holding a fortune. My reflection in the window looked like a stranger's wide-eyed and pale lips, pressed tight to keep from spilling the secret out loud. Finally, I sat back on the bed, the envelope clutched in my lap. My body shook so hard I could barely keep still. I wanted to call someone to share the news, but the only thought that came was how quickly it would no longer be mine if I did. The clock ticked past midnight, and still I sat there staring at the envelope. A secret worth $300 million pulsed in my hands, and for the first time in my life, the silence around me felt like both a shield and a prison. The next morning I woke with the ticket still tucked under my pillow, my head heavy from a night without sleep. My heart pounded as I drove across the George Washington Bridge toward the New Jersey lottery office. The drive felt endless, each red light daring me to turn around. But I kept going, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they ached. Inside the office, the air smelled like paper and disinfectant. I handed the ticket over to the clerk, my fingers trembling as if I were letting go of a piece of my soul. She scanned it, her eyes widening slightly before she nodded and congratulated me. Just like that, with a few keystrokes, my life split into 2 parts, before and after. After taxes, the payout came to just over $220 million. The figure didn't even feel real. I signed the forms, smiled stiffly for the photographs I knew I'd asked them to keep private, and then walked back to my car with a folder full of documents and a heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't go shopping or celebrate. Instead, I found the nearest bank branch, then another and another. I split the money across accounts, diversifying, spreading it like seeds I wasn't ready to see grow. In one account, I placed $10 million for charity. I thought of the women's shelter downtown, the children's hospital. the food pantry that always seemed short on donations. Writing those checks brought me a strange kind of peace, as if I were giving away the pain my family had planted in me. Then I made one indulgence. I walked into a real estate office in Manhattan, my palms sweating, and by the end of the week, I had signed for a penthouse overlooking Central Park. $8 million. Floor-to-ceiling windows, marble floors, a view that stretched across the skyline. It was everything my family would have mocked me for dreaming about. And yet, I didn't move in. The thought of living in that palace alone, so far removed from the life I had known, made my chest ache. I kept the keys in my drawer beside the bank statements and returned each night to my cramped studio in Newark. I still rode the subway, still packed leftovers for lunch, still walked into work with the same worn-out shoes. I needed the disguise. If my family suspected, if even one whisper reached them, the vultures would descend. A few weeks later, I visited my parents' house in San Francisco. It had been months since the wedding, and part of me wanted to test whether the distance between us had softened. When I stepped inside, the smell of fresh paint and baby powder hit me. My old bedroom door stood wide open. Inside, the walls had been painted yellow, a crib pushed against the window. Toys were stacked neatly in bins, and the rocking chair where I used to sit and read had been replaced with a changing table. Lauren stood in the middle of the room, folding tiny onesies into a drawer. She glanced up at me, her smile wide and smug. "Well, Emily," she said lightly, "this room is finally being put to good use." The words stung sharper than I expected. I forced a smile, nodding as if it didn't matter. But inside, a heat rose in me, a quiet storm building beneath my ribs. She had no idea. None of them did. I walked through the house, listening to my parents gush about Michael's promotion, Lauren's pregnancy, the plans for the nanny who would live with them. They never asked about my job, my apartment, my life. To them, I was already a shadow, a guest passing through. When I excused myself to leave, Lauren followed me to the door. She placed a hand on her stomach and tilted her head, her voice dipped in mock sweetness. "You'll understand someday, Emily. Once you have a family of your own, you won't care about these things." I bit my tongue, swallowing back the words that clawed at my throat. That I could buy and sell this house 10 times over. That while she measured her worth in hand-me-down walls, I had built a kingdom in silence. Instead, I smiled, hugged her briefly, and walked out into the evening air. As I drove away, the lights of the house faded in my rearview mirror. They thought they had erased me. They thought I had been pushed aside, forgotten, left to scrape by. But in the quiet of my car, I gripped the steering wheel and let the secret warm me like fire. They would never see it coming. And that knowledge was more intoxicating than all the money in the world. Thanksgiving in 2023 arrived with the usual fanfare. Margaret called me a week before, insisting that I come home, her voice chipper, as if nothing had ever fractured between us. I agreed, though my stomach nodded at the thought of sitting at that table again. When I walked through the front door, the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon pies filled the air. The house glowed with golden light, the same house I had once called home, but now felt like a stranger's stage set. Michael greeted me with a stiff hug, Lauren gave me a kiss on the cheek that barely grazed my skin, and my parents beamed like the family portrait was complete again. The dining table was dressed in fine china, polished silver, and crystal glasses. Laughter floated through the air as relatives gathered glasses, clinking children running around. From the outside, it looked like warmth. From where I sat, it felt like a carefully rehearsed play, one where my role had been cut long ago, but I was still expected to sit quietly in the audience. I tried to blend in, scooping mashed potatoes onto my plate, sipping wine, nodding at conversations about promotions, mortgages, and college applications. But then Lauren's voice rang out clear and deliberate, carrying just enough weight to silence the chatter around her. "Emily," she said sweetly, "you know a girl doesn't really need her own house. All she needs is to find a good husband who can provide." The room erupted in light laughter, my parents chuckling along as if it were a harmless joke. Even Michael smirked his eyes, avoiding mine. Heat surged into my face and I gripped my fork so tightly it pressed into my palm. My chest burned with humiliation, though I forced a smile, the kind of smile that hurt more than tears. The conversation moved on, but the sting lingered. Every word reminded me of how little they thought of me, how easily they dismissed my place in the family. I sat there listening to the clatter of forks and the easy banter, and the truth settled heavy in my gut. I had never really belonged here. Not as a daughter, not as a sister, not as anything but an afterthought. I set my glass down, my voice low but steady, caring just enough to be heard. What if I were richer than all of you? The table went silent for a breath. The kind of silence that makes you aware of every pair of eyes on you. Lauren blinked, then tilted her head back and let out a laugh, sharp and cutting. "Oh, Emily," she said, almost pitying, as if she were humoring a child. "We both know that's impossible." Her laughter spread around the table, others chuckling nervously, joining in, because it was easier to laugh than to question. My parents smiled, Michael shook his head, and I sat frozen, my throat tightening with every sound. What hurt most wasn't their laughter. It was how easily they assumed the hierarchy of our lives was permanent, as if I was destined to remain at the bottom while they dined in comfort. My question had unsettled them for a heartbeat, but then they had dismissed me with a laugh. I swallowed hard, pressing the words down until they burned like glass in my chest. I wanted to tell them the truth, but instead I lifted my glass and let their laughter pass over me. The silence inside me wasn't a weakness anymore. It was fuel. Inside my heart cracked, but beneath the pain was steel. Let them laugh, I thought. Let them believe. Because when the day came when the tables finally turned, their laughter would echo back at them like a curse. I excused myself soon after, carrying my plate into the kitchen, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. Margaret followed, her voice hushed as she asked if I was all right. I nodded, forcing my lips into another brittle smile. "Yes, Mom, I'm fine." She seemed relieved, patted my arm, and walked back out to the dining room. I stood there in the quiet, staring at the steam rising from the sink, and felt the weight of my secret pressing harder than ever. They thought they had broken me with their words, but all they had done was remind me of the power I held hidden just out of sight. When I returned to the table, Lauren was in the middle of another story, her laughter ringing loud, her hand resting smugly on her rounded belly. I slid back into my seat, nodding, smiling, pretending. But inside, I was no longer pretending. I was planning. Spring of 2024 brought news that reached me like an echo from a world I no longer belonged to. Nancy Lauren's mother had been diagnosed with late-stage cancer. The cost of treatment, even after insurance, was staggering. $80,000 stood between them and hope, and suddenly the family that had erased me remembered my number. It was Michael who showed up first. I came home from work one evening to find him standing in the dim hallway outside my apartment, shoulders hunched, his suit rumpled. He looked older than his 33 years, lines of stress carving into his face. "Emily," he said softly, "can we talk?" I let him in, though my chest was already tightening. He sat on the edge of my couch, staring at his hands. Lauren joined him a few minutes later, her perfume filling the small room, her belly rounded from pregnancy. They looked so out of place in my cramped studio, like royalty forced to wait in a bus station. Lauren cleared her throat. "My mom, she's sick. Ovarian cancer. The treatments aren't covered by insurance. We're doing everything we can, but the bills are overwhelming." She hesitated, her voice trembling in just the right places. "We were hoping, maybe you could help." The words hung in the air, heavy and desperate. Michael kept his head bowed, shame written in every line of his body. Lauren's eyes, though wet, still carried that sharp glint, the one that had mocked me over Thanksgiving dinner, the one that had dismissed me as nothing but a spinster in waiting. I stared at them, memories flooding in like a tide I couldn't hold back. The wedding day when they had smiled as the deed to the family house was handed to them. The way my bedroom had been cleared out for their nanny. The laughter around the table when Lauren said I didn't need a home of my own, when everyone chuckled at the idea of me being wealthy. And now, here they were, sitting in my apartment, hands outstretched. I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms across my chest. My voice came out calm, almost too calm. "You're asking me for money." Michael finally looked up, his eyes pleading. "It's not for us, Em. It's for Nancy. She doesn't deserve this." I let out a dry laugh, sharp enough to make Lauren flinch. "And I deserved what you all gave me. I deserved to be erased from my own family." Lauren's voice rose desperate, but still coated in the entitlement she couldn't hide. "This is different. It's life and death. You're her only chance." The room went quiet. I could hear the hum of my refrigerator, the distant noise of traffic outside. My hands trembled in my lap, not from fear, but from the storm of emotions fighting inside me. Anger, grief, vindication. I thought of Nancy, a woman who had smiled politely at me at family gatherings, but never once asked about my life. A woman who, like the rest of them, saw me as an accessory, not as a daughter, not as a person. I shook my head slowly, each word deliberate. "I am not this family's bank." The silence that followed was absolute. Michael's lips parted, but no words came. Lauren's face paled, her mouth twisting, as if she couldn't believe what she'd just heard. I stood walking toward the door, my hands steady now. "You took everything from me," I said, my voice low. "You made sure I had nothing, and now you come here asking for what you never gave." Michael rose, his eyes shining, but I held up my hand to stop him. "Don't." Lauren finally broke the silence, her voice sharp with disbelief. "Emily, how can you be so cold?" I met her gaze, feeling the fire steady in my chest. "Cold?" "No. Just done." I opened the door, the hallway light spilling in. Neither of them moved. For a moment it looked as though Michael might speak again, but then he lowered his eyes and walked out. Lauren followed her heels, clicking against the floor, her back rigid with fury. When the door shut behind them, I pressed my hands against the wood, my breath coming in shallow bursts. My body shook not with regret, but with release. For the first time I had spoken aloud the truth I had carried in silence for years. I wasn't their afterthought anymore. I wasn't their safety net. I was free. The knock on my door came 2 weeks after I had sent Michael and Lauren away. This time it was just Michael, and when I opened the door, I almost didn't recognize him. His face was gray with exhaustion, his eyes bloodshot, his shoulders slumped as if he carried a weight too heavy for one man. He had always been the golden boy of the family, the confident one, the chosen one. But standing there in the dim light of my apartment hallway, he looked broken. He carried a folder under his arm, clutching it like a lifeline. Without a word, I stepped aside, and he entered, moving slowly, as though his body resisted each step. He sat at my kitchen table, the same small battered table where I had eaten countless bowls of instant noodles when I could barely afford anything else. Now he sat there like a man about to confess a crime. He slid the folder across to me, his hands trembling. Inside was a single sheet of paper thick with official seals, a promissory note for $1 million signed and notarized. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. "Think of it as repayment. For what we did. For what we took." I stared at the paper, my chest tightening. $1 million. A number that would have once meant everything to me. It would have been the answer to sleepless nights in Newark, the difference between fear and security, the proof that I had not been forgotten, proof that I had mattered. But now, with my secret fortune resting safely in accounts across the country, it was little more than a gesture. I looked up at him. He couldn't meet my eyes. His shame clung to him like a second skin, heavy and suffocating. For a moment I almost pitied him. Almost. I folded the paper neatly and slipped it back into the envelope. My voice was quiet, even the kind of calm that cuts deeper than anger. "You think this makes us even?" He flinched, but finally forced himself to meet my gaze. His eyes were glassy, filled with a sorrow I had never seen before. "No, nothing will. But that's all I can do." His words hung in the air, fragile and bitter. He stood slowly, his shoulders bent, and without another word he walked out. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving me alone in the silence. I sat at the table with the envelope heavy in my hands. For the first time, I realized that restitution was not the same as reconciliation. This wasn't healing. It was bargaining. A desperate attempt to rewrite the story too late. I didn't feel erased anymore. What I felt was distance, a chasm so wide that no piece of paper could bridge it. The $1 million wasn't about me, it was about his guilt. And guilt, I thought, bitterly always comes at a discount compared to what was truly lost. At work, Ethan began watching me differently. He was observant, always had been, but now his gaze lingered longer. He noticed when I left earlier than usual, when my clothes shifted from modest thrift finds to subtle elegance when my eyes carried a new sharpness. One afternoon, he leaned against my desk, his smile kind but probing. "You're different these days, Emily. Stronger. Like you're carrying something." I forced a laugh, brushing it off. Maybe I finally stopped caring what people think. But inside, I knew he was right. I was carrying something. A secret that separated me from everyone around me, even from him. The studio apartment that had once been my sanctuary grew unbearable. The cramped walls, once a symbol of independence, now pressed in like a cage. Every night I returned to the same 400 square feet, the refrigerator humming too loudly, the radiator clanking with every shift in temperature. I paced the narrow strip of floor between my bed and the window, staring out at the Newark skyline, knowing I had another life waiting for me just across the river. I thought about what it would mean to leave this place behind. The studio had been my proving ground, the place where I rebuilt myself from nothing. But it had also been a constant reminder of humiliation, of the laughter at my expense, of my family's betrayal. The walls whispered memories of nights when I had cried silently, clutching my pillow, terrified of bills and rent, and the fragility of my future. One morning I couldn't take it anymore. I packed everything that mattered into 2 suitcases. My clothes, a few books, a framed photo of me and my late grandmother, the only family member who had ever truly seen me. The rest I left behind, things I no longer needed to carry. By afternoon, I was standing in the marble lobby of the New York penthouse I had bought months earlier, but had never dared to claim. The concierge greeted me by name, his professionalism flawless, but his eyes flickered with recognition. I was no longer the girl scraping by in Newark. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped into a space that seemed carved out of another world. The penthouse took my breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the living room, the city unfurling at my feet like a promise. The air smelled of polished wood and new beginnings. I set my suitcases down and walked slowly through each room, touching the walls, the countertops, the cool glass. This was mine. Not given, not borrowed, not taken from me and returned like scraps. Mine. I paused in the master bedroom, running my fingers along the smooth edge of the bed frame, and I thought about Michael's promissory note. A desperate attempt at atonement. $1 million placed in my hands, as if money could erase years of humiliation, neglect, and betrayal. But I didn't need it. I didn't need them. As the sun dipped below the skyline, casting the apartment in shades of gold and fire, I opened the balcony doors and stepped into the cool evening air. The sounds of the city drifted up alive and endless. For a long time, I simply stood there, breathing in the freedom, the vastness, the certainty that I had finally stepped out of their shadow. Behind me, the envelope with Michael's promissory note lay unopened on the counter, a relic of the past. I left it there untouched, as a reminder of everything I had overcome. For the first time, I felt what freedom truly tasted like. And it was sharper, sweeter, and more intoxicating than anything they had ever offered me. By 2025, the penthouse had become my sanctuary. Each morning I stood by the tall windows, coffee in hand, watching the city below wake up in waves of light and sound. From this height, the chaos of the streets looked small, almost distant, and I felt a calm I had never known inside my family's house. News of them still reached me sometimes through relatives, sometimes through whispers I overheard when I went back to Newark to tie up loose ends. Michael's career had taken a sharp turn downward. The bank he managed lost a major client, and rumors spread that he had mishandled accounts. His name, once spoken with respect, was now tangled with doubt and mistrust. Lauren's world crumbled in its own way. Her closets, full of designer handbags and jewelry, slowly emptied one item at a time, each sold off to cover debts. I imagined her at consignment counters smiling through gritted teeth as strangers appraised what she once flaunted. She had spent years measuring her worth in possessions, and now those possessions slipped through her fingers like sand. Nancy, her mother, didn't survive the year. The treatments bought her time, but not enough. When she passed, the grief in Lauren's face was real, but so was the desperation. Medical bills piled high unpaid, hanging over them like a storm that wouldn't break. I didn't attend the funeral. I didn't send flowers or condolences. I stayed in my penthouse, standing by the window, looking out at the city that had become my refuge. My silence was my answer. Sometimes I wondered if they thought of me, if they replayed the words I had spoken when they asked for help. I am not this family's bank. I wondered if they finally understood what it felt like to be abandoned, to be left without a safety net. Ethan reached out now and then, inviting me to dinner or drinks, his tone light but curious. He could sense I was different, but he didn't press. I appreciated his kindness, but I kept my world small, my secret locked away. Freedom had a taste, and I wasn't ready to trade it for explanations or confessions. One evening, as the sun sank behind the skyline, painting the glass towers in shades of gold, I stepped onto the balcony. The air was cool, the city alive beneath me. For a long moment, I simply breathed, letting the past slip further away. The girl who once sat at a family table, humiliated by laughter, erased by signatures on a page, no longer existed. In her place stood a woman who had built her own future not from inheritance or handouts, but from resilience and a twist of fate that no one could have predicted. My voice rose softly in the quiet, as if confessing to the night. After my brother's wedding, I was abandoned with nothing. But from that moment, I found the strength to live for myself. When fortune came knocking, I no longer needed anyone's approval. I closed my eyes, the city lights pressing against the darkness, and let the words settle deep inside me. The past no longer held me. The future was mine. After my brother's wedding, I was abandoned with nothing. But from that moment, I found the strength to live for myself. When fortune came knocking, I no longer needed anyone's approval. My new principle is very simple. I no longer try to prove my worth to a family that once laughed at me when I had nothing. I choose to surround myself with people who see that I am enough, even without titles, wealth, or recognition. For me, family is not defined by blood. Family is the people who stand by you when others turn away, the ones who believe in you even when the world sees you as invisible. And I have witnessed with my own eyes what many call karma. Those who once cast me aside have paid the price through their downfall, loneliness, and loss. Meanwhile, when I stopped seeking their approval, I found freedom, happiness, and a life they could never have imagined for me. If you are listening now, you understand this truth. Revenge does not always require loud actions. Sometimes it only takes patience and letting karma do its work. Have you ever seen karma catch up with those who hurt you? Do you believe that justice always arrives, even if it comes late? I would love to hear your story in the comments. And if this message resonates with you, share it with someone who needs to know that the universe always balances itself. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories where karma finds the right address and self-respect becomes the greatest